I'm going to give people one more minute to arrive. But as you're waiting, I would like to draw your attention to the Access document, and you can click on that, and that will lead you to all of the slides and the information for today's program. Okay, welcome. Thank you for joining us this afternoon for Long COVID and Chronic Illness, Understanding Christianity, Worship and Access, a webinar presentation sponsored by the Calvin Institute for Christian Worship and the Center of Theological Inquiry. I'm Erin Raffety. I am a white woman with short brown hair. I'm wearing a navy turtleneck tank top, and I'm sitting in my office with orange walls. I am the principal investigator for this research project, and I am joined by Emma Worrall, my research assistant. Our full bios, as well as images, texts, image descriptions, and transcript for this presentation are available via the link in the Access document that's appearing in the chat. We are also pleased to be joined by ASL interpreters Craig Ridgway and Kathy Farrajon, who are pinned in your screen and will be providing live ASL interpretation for the event. We will begin with some poetry reading by Camisha L. Jones. Then Emma and I will present some of our preliminary findings from our research project on Christianity, chronic illness, and long COVID. Next, we will hear from a panel of 3 of our research participants. And finally, we will have 15 minutes for you to pose questions about the research to us and the panelists about their experiences. We will invite you at that time to type your questions into the Q&A box, which we will moderate as well. With the permission of the panelists, we will record the webinar today so it can be shared with a larger audience at a later date. Please feel free to check in and out as you need and honor your own access needs. We hope you enjoy the webinar. Without further ado, I am thrilled to introduce our poet for the event, Camisha L. Jones. Camisha L. Jones, she, her pronouns, is the author of Flare, a publication of Finishing Line Press. The book focuses largely on her experiences with hearing loss and chronic pain. Her poems have been published in the New York Times, Button Poetry, the Deaf Poet Society, Beltway Poetry Quarterly, Typo, The Quarry, a social justice poetry database at Split This Rock, and elsewhere. She is a 2022 Disability Futures Fellow supported by United States artists, the Ford Foundation, and Mellon Foundation. The poems Camisha will be sharing with us are available in the Access document, should you wish to follow along. Camisha, thank you so much for sharing your poetry with us today.
And thank you, Erin and Emma and the Calvin Institute for Christian Worship and the Christian Center for Theological Inquiry for inviting me into this space and creating this space for this very important conversation. For visual access, I am a brown-skinned Black cis woman wearing an orange dress and a chunky necklace made of wood. My naturally coily hair is styled in spiral curls on one side and flat twists pulled back on the other. I'm wearing purple and Black rimmed glasses and hearing aids. I'm going to share 3 poems, all of which are focused on my journey with chronic pain and illness. The first poem is called Intersection. When I confess the pain, they tell me of a glad morning. They say I come out of this with a long-awaited joy. Still, I become a fiery tongue to scorch the earth, the bluest flame licking each muscle and joint. They send their prayers, cover me with expectations. How to forgive the body of its many sins. How to forgive what's already on its knees unrepentant. They say I am healed. They say it is already done. I come out, I scorch the earth, I leave only ash. If I pray, I come out of this, they say. My hands learn not to flick the lighter, my bones unlearn the taste for char. I forgive, I pray, I scorch this earth, become one with its combustion. If I wait, they say, my change will come. I am the fire. I am the smoke. I strike the match. I strike the match. So that's the first poem. This next poem is called Ode to the Chronically Ill Body. Ode to the Chronically Ill Body. This body is one long moan. My feet, a landscape of mines. My legs, 2 full pails of water I spill at the weight of. My back, where the sharpest knives are kept. My hands, a scatter of matches ready to spark into flames. This body is lightning. Strikes the same place more than twice. This body is a fist pounding its own hand. This body crumples like paper. I crumple like paper because of this body. This body just wants and wants and wants. This body says stop, says go, says stop, says run, says stop. Says stop. This body is a stubborn traffic light stuck on red. This body will have what it wants, or it is blasphemous tantrum down every grocery store aisle. This body makes an embarrassment of me. This body is an embarrassment. Then pleasure, then hunger, then defender, then defendant, then carriage, then coffin. This body is Tupperware with its secret sealed tight. This body scrapes and falls and gets back up again and again. It's all I got to get back up with again. This body is an ocean of oil spill all over me. I hope everyone's breathing with me as I'm doing these poems. This final poem is called Praise Song for the Body. Praise the body that takes pain and names it survival. Drinks anguish without ruling it bitter. Contains the daggers of sickness and bends them into a good home, a shelter, an escape route. Call this body miracle. Call it sanctuary. Name its ghosts, but refuse to believe it is haunted. Refuse to give up on hope and all of its helium, its elevating power to raise this weighted vessel into a thing of light. Thank you.
I'm going to say amen. Thank you, Camisha, for getting us started in such a moving way. Emma and I are now going to present some of the preliminary findings from our interview study conducted from November 2022 through January 2023 with Christian research subjects living with long COVID and/or chronic illness. Feel free to write down questions as you listen for the Q&A later in the program. For the moment, I want to share that this study was sponsored by a Calvin Institute for Christian Worship grant and the Center of Theological Inquiry, and our IRB permission for research with human subjects was secured through Princeton University.
My name is Emma, and for accessibility, I am a white female with short brown hair, pixie cut that sways to the side. I have green rim glasses, and I'm wearing a white t-shirt with a pink button up over it. So we can say more about the study design and its limitations of it in the Q&A, but 18 subjects were identified as chronically ill and Christian were recruited online and interviewed via Zoom in 2022 and 2023. So the map shows the locations of our interviewees across the United States. The most common chronic illness among the 7 people interviewed with chronic illness were chronic fatigue syndrome and autoimmune diseases, but asthma, diabetes, celiac, endometriosis, rheumatoid arthritis, and co-occurring mental health diagnoses were also present among the sample. The most common symptoms of the 5 people interviewed with long COVID included dysautonomia, fatigue, headaches, and respiratory symptoms. Now, as the graphic shows, 6 individuals experienced both chronic illness and long COVID. Although this is a small study, it should be clear that this is not meant to be a representative sample. Instead, it should be emphasized that this is a purposive sample, meaning we purposefully selected Christian individuals living with chronic illness and long COVID, with a variety of denominational, racial, ethnic, and illness backgrounds in order to gain a qualitative understanding of the relationship between their Christian faith and their chronic illnesses.
One resounding finding of the study is that Christians living with chronic illness and/or long COVID reported unprecedented access to Christian worship and community connections online due to the expansion of these services during the COVID-19 pandemic. Respondents talked about the way that their needs for flexibility, worship from home, rest, and wellness were honored and normalized through the new expansiveness of online church offerings. They also talked about finding community connections online through both secular and Christian groups, including social media outlets such as Facebook, Slack, and WhatsApp. This allowed many chronically ill people and COVID long haulers to feel connected to others with similar experiences, which was meaningful. Finally, many respondents mentioned that they felt supported when they were hospitalized or underwent surgery because Christian communities responded with food, prayer, and tangible short-term crisis care. However, many people reported feeling lonely and isolated and not having access to community in offline spaces. People spoke eloquently about how the church's approach to caregiving is based on a Band-Aid, short-term or crisis model, and ignores or leaves behind people who suffer from long-term illness. Finally, people reported a feeling of shame around how their illness was perceived by the church and what it prevented them from doing. I don't do things, or I don't go to things, were common refrains that suggested many chronically ill people have come to take responsibility for their lack of access, rather than considering that lack of access may be a problem that the church can or should help manage. This identifies a major tension in our data that highlighted ambivalence when it comes to a theology of chronic illness. Indeed, it seems that the church has failed to provide a comprehensive theology of chronic illness. Thus, we saw folks feeling fragmented and working hard to reconfigure, adjust, and reconstruct their own operative understandings of God, themselves, and hope. The data suggest two contrasting theologies or hermeneutics, which are ways of theologically interpreting the chronically ill experience. This image shows how some folks espousing a traditional hermeneutic may be newly ill and then migrate across the bridge to a chronically ill hermeneutic as they progress through their illness. Others may find comfort in a traditional hermeneutic because it coheres with a particular cultural or denominational community. Some experiences that may push an individual toward a chronic illness hermeneutic may be an identification of chronically ill, ultimate questions, or the search for a theology that incorporates suffering and death. In turn, persons espousing a chronic illness hermeneutic are often people who have lived with a chronic illness for a long time period and may experience some estrangement from family or church communities as a result of these beliefs. Although both theologies came across in our data, most interviewees expressed some frustration with the traditional hermeneutic and articulated a hermeneutic that centered their chronic illness experience. However, the two theologies are neither separate nor rigid. Rather, they are suggested as archetypes rather than actualities, as individuals incorporated aspects of both theologies into their beliefs. We call the first theological position a traditional hermeneutic. This hermeneutic is well substantiated in other theological studies of suffering and disability. The traditional hermeneutic we observed with respect to chronic illness places emphasis on God as a powerful healer and Jesus as a conqueror and miracle worker. Illness is viewed as temporary, movable by great faith, and therefore not particularly integral to who a person is. Finally, hope in this hermeneutic amounts to hope of being cured from illness, showing that there is often a conflict between illness and wellness for people with a traditional hermeneutic. This quote presents an example of identity in the traditional hermeneutic. This interviewee says, "My chronic illness is not who I am. It's just a circumstance where I find myself. So who I am is based on how I was created. I know what I have in me, that God has bestowed in me. It's just the perfect one and not my chronic illness. It shouldn't define me, because as soon as it defines me, simply means there's every possibility and tendency that it will wear me down. Yeah, it will discourage me. If my chronic illness should define who I am, it might end up doing more harm rather than good. This quote shows how the interviewee holds chronic illness apart from the perfect identity she has been given in God, because it will do more harm than good. Many individuals with a traditional hermeneutic also place their hope in God's healing of their illness. This interviewee says, I still have the hope in God that I will be okay. One day I'll be free from illness. One day I'll be able to get well, free. I have hope of getting better right now. I still have the hope that the illness will be totally eradicated from me in a very short time. The eradication of illness is seen as evidence of God's action and the fulfillment of hope.
In a chronic illness hermeneutic, interviewees viewed God as disabled like them and took comfort in the mystery, wildness, and bigness of God. Interviewees took comfort in Jesus's wounds that remained in resurrection and Jesus's incarnate life and suffering with them. This God was not a conqueror, but with them in their suffering. Individuals expressed that their chronic illness was a significant part of their identity, but also a paradoxical one. They had learned much about themselves and God through their circumstances, but they had also endured suffering. These individuals expressed hope in their connections with God and community. Because they had largely abandoned hope in being cured of chronic illness or long COVID, they experienced that viewpoint of hope as narrow and even harmful. Some mentioned that gratitude was a more meaningful term for them when it came to their relationship with God and their chronic illness. Many respondents who expressed a chronic illness hermeneutic emphasized the mystery of God. As one respondent said, maybe God healed me through my surgeon. Maybe the Gospels do apply to me in that way. I have to remember to make room for God, to act in ways that are more of a mystery. Oh, it wasn't this poof healing. It was being in a surgical theater with 15 people and having parts of me cut out and incinerated. God's job wasn't taking away the pain. God's job was being bigger than the pain could ever touch. Those who emphasized a chronic illness hermeneutic also discussed the importance of Jesus's broken body, God's understanding of suffering through the incarnation, and because of this, a deep faith that God is ever present. One interviewee commented, "The imagery of Jesus being resurrected with his wounds has been really important, because even if I get better tomorrow, I will never be the person I was, especially with an illness that is chronic, it is looking like it will be with me for the foreseeable future. There's so many things that I'm grieving that I can no longer do. And Jesus's resurrected ministry is an embodied ministry with like enfleshed brokenness. Everything does not happen for a reason. Sometimes shit just happens, but God shows up in the middle of it. For me, that's what I have faith in, that God shows up as I feel the most broken, knowing what that feels like." We'd like to close with some pieces of advice for clergy, lay leaders, and church communities seeking to support people living with chronic illness and/or long COVID. 1, don't weaponize surprise. By saying things like, "You're still sick," or "You haven't gotten better yet," it makes the situation more about you being in the know rather than truly caring for the person. Number two, almost all of the participants said that the church is really good with acute emergencies or short-term care, but sorely lacking with long-term care. Even if the person does not reach out for help, they will need help for the rest of their lives with transportation, with meal trains, and pastoral care. Bottom line, reach out. Picture yourself as Simon of Cyrene helping Jesus carry his cross. 3, rites of passage. One of our participants said, "We have baby showers for women when they become mothers to make sure they have everything they need. What about us? Why isn't there a party for when you are diagnosed with a chronic illness? I need a registry." How can the church provide newly diagnosed people with things that they need? 4, be with, don't fix. We can take our lead from Jesus weeping with Mary and Martha when Lazarus died. When chronically ill people come to you with a problem, 9.8 times out of 10, they are not asking you to go into problem-solving mode. Share their burdens of crying by crying with them and being angry with them so they don't feel alone. 5, always also be aware that sometimes it is a burden for chronically ill people to receive help. You can cook food for the person, but what if they can't get up to reheat the food you brought them? If you come over, they have to use extra energy to clean up or get ready for a guest. Remember that the chronically ill also reserve the right to privacy. Sometimes they are in states that are dehumanizing and do not wish others to see them in this way. 6, representation. Just because someone is chronically ill doesn't mean they can't contribute to church ministry and that their faithfulness in suffering isn't meaningful. Some chronically ill people recommended having images of those who are chronically ill visible in sanctuaries and churches. If you are clergy and teaching or preaching, invite chronically ill people to help you interpret scriptures and even preach, increasing their voices and visibility in community. 7, it is only once the pandemic started and all of society shut down that we found ways of reaching to the homebound. Yet there have been many who have always been homebound. One participant said, "With the pandemic, we found out what we could have been doing all along, but we said it was impossible." Online services represent an important and vital ministry through which chronically ill people connect to faith. And number 8, chronically ill people urge the church to remember to approach their experience with humility and to remember that they are not God. As a church, we need to acknowledge the mystery of God when it comes to suffering and questions about what God is doing. And we also acknowledge our role in the suffering of others. Only by doing this can we truly repent and find ways of supporting the chronically ill body of Christ.
Our last slide identifies some resources that were recommended to us by participants, as well as some we recommend to you from our library, including the Body Politic Community Support Group for Long COVID, which you can click the link in the Access doc for more information on that. And these books, Leah Lakshmi Peepsna Samarasinha's Care Work, Dreaming Disability Justice. My book is in the Center From Inclusion to Justice. And Kathy Black's book, A Healing Homiletic, Preaching and Disability. So that concludes our research presentation. And we now welcome 3 of our interviewees, Dr. Catherine Meeks, Reverend Kate Harmon Siberine, and Sarah Council Turner, to share some of their reflections on their Christian faith and chronic illness experiences with us. You will be welcome to direct questions about the research findings we just shared, or questions directly to the panelists following the conclusion of the panel. And I will begin by reading a brief biography of each of the panelists, and then I will ask them a series of questions. Dr. Catherine Meeks, she, her pronouns, is a distinguished scholar, a community service and racial justice advocate, and currently serves as the executive director of the Absalom Jones Center for Racial Healing. She is also the author of 8 books, her most recent of which is titled The Night is Long, but Light Comes in the Morning, Meditations on Racial Healing. She is the recipient of numerous awards, including Georgia Sociologist of the Year, the NAACP Earl Shinholster Freedom Fund Award, the W.E.B. Du Bois Award for Distinguished Community Service, and the President Joseph R. Biden Lifetime Achievement and Service Award conferred in August 2022. She has been a faithful member of the Episcopalian Church for 40 years and has also lived with rheumatoid arthritis for 36 years. The Reverend Kate Harmon Siberine, she, her pronouns, is a church planter of the New Episcopal Mission of Franklin, New Hampshire, and rector of Grace Episcopal Church in East Concord, New Hampshire. Kate is passionate about helping people of all ages claim their own discipleship and making the church truly accessible for all. She is a graduate of Virginia Theological Seminary and University of Wisconsin at Madison. When not seeking to knock down barriers or preach the good news, Kate can be found with her spouse, Zach, and their dog, Murphy, with a cup of tea in the garden. Sarah Council Turner, she, her pronouns, is an artist living in Reading, Pennsylvania. Her roots are in the Episcopal Church, and she currently belongs to a UCC church where her husband is the pastor. She has been living with myalgic encephalomyelitis chronic fatigue syndrome, or MECFS, for more than 16 years. So Dr. Meeks, Kate, and Sarah, welcome. We are so pleased to have each of you with us. And I'm going to go ahead and pose the first question and invite Dr. Meeks to share first. So the first question is, please introduce yourself briefly and tell us a story about your experience of chronic illness and church. Dr. Meeks.
Okay, do you want me to describe myself?
That would be great.
All right, so let me see if I can say I am sort of like a dark chocolate bar, and my hair is kind of silver. It's turning gray fast, and I've got on white glasses. I'm an African-American woman, and I have on clothing that has a lot of red and turquoise in it. So because I love color. So I have lived for the last now close to 40 years with rheumatoid arthritis, and 2 years ago a year and a half ago, had 2 hip joint replacements. So I have had many opportunities to make a lot of choices and decisions about how I was planning to live in the world. And I think one of the things that I have to say about, for me, things are much, much more about faith than church. The church house is a good representative container for me, but it's about the kind of the connection that I have, the sense that I have with God and all of what I call the heavenly kitchen cabinet that looks out after me. And I was just thinking as I've been listening to the research and thinking about all of this today, that one of the most important decisions that I had to come to terms with, which my faith helped me to do, was to separate myself from my illness and to understand that rheumatoid arthritis was a state of being that I had, but that I had a body and a mind and a soul, and that those things were not rheumatoid arthritis. Rheumatoid arthritis was a factor, and I had to be clear about that so that I didn't begin to see myself as somebody who was totally controlled by this thing that had taken me over. And one of the toughest jobs I had to face as a parent with young children was managing them with arthritis, because arthritis started when I was in my early 30s, and I would have to get up like at 4 o'clock in the morning in order to get myself going before my sons got up, to get them off to school, and then try to get myself to class because I was a professor. And people kept trying to encourage me to quit work and to just declare myself disabled, and so that I didn't have to do those things. And I knew that that would be making a choice not to live. If I just decided that I wanted to be, see myself as a person who had allowed arthritis to become my total identity, to allow this chronic illness to become the definer of me as a human being, that I could not do that. And so I didn't. And it was my faith, my belief that was probably even deeper than belief, my absolute counting on that if I kept on making the decision to get up every day and go forward, that I would find what I needed in order to do that. And that was the thing that has been, that decision way back then has been a sustaining factor for all these years. And it's still true that every day it's still a decision. It's a decision to get up and keep going, to go forward, to do what needs to be done in spite of the limitations, in spite of what I have to accommodate, and to keep knowing that arthritis is a part of who I am, but not what I am in total.
Thank you so much, Dr. Meeks. We'll move on to Kate. And the same question, Kate, would you be willing to introduce yourself and share a story about your experience of chronic illness in the church?
Absolutely. I am Kate. For a visual description for accessibility, I'm a cis white woman with short red hair and red lipstick, wearing clear frame glasses, a black clergy shirt with a white clergy collar, and a tan curtain backdrop and turquoise walls. I'm all about the colors as well.
Mm-hmm.
I want to name up front that long COVID is feeling particularly present in my life and ministry this week. I had some neurological testing at Tuesday at my long COVID clinic, and combined with the poor air quality from the wildfires in Nova Scotia, it's really exacerbated my post-COVID breathing issues, as is so true for so many people around the world who are dealing both with a crisis of long COVID and the COVID pandemic, and also the climate crisis. So there may be a few times, I'm going to try to be really good about needing to pause, and there may be a few times that I ask you to take a few deep breaths with me, but that feels really appropriate given the conversation that we're having, given the ways that we're sort of discerning together in this season of Pentecost, what the Spirit is up to in the church and in our world, and in a world where most people are convinced that the COVID pandemic is over, even though we know it's definitely not for the disabled, the immunocompromised, and the chronically ill. So it feels good to make this space and have this space. I'm so grateful to be able to be here. So a bit of background for me, January 2022, January 1st, I came down with COVID, which led to COVID pneumonia and a miscarriage. And I sort of assumed that when my fever finally broke, which it did after 22 days, that I would get better. That I would be able to breathe again, that my heart rate wouldn't be like in the 150s laying down, but it never did. So my COVID presents primarily as dysautonomia with respiratory muscle weakness, tachycardia, so racing fast heart rate, fatigue, bone crushing fatigue, and cognitive impairment. I was on short-term disability for 6 months, and I was able to strengthen my lungs. Then for another 6 months, tried every medication under the sun to try to get my heart rate under control. And then finally, 6 months ago, finding a medication that kind of sort of works, combined with a motorized wheelchair so that I put less strain on my heart. And so finally, I'm able to be back leading church services without damaging my recovery. And it was so interesting coming back to work because I've always been so proud of my 2 churches because unlike so many of our church buildings, they are actually accessible. They're all 1 story, there's ramps, there's accessible bathrooms. But I never noticed until I got sick that every single space in the church was accessible except for the altar. We have always prided ourselves on being welcoming and inclusive. But in retrospect, from where I sit right now, it feels a bit more like charity than it feels like inclusion. It never occurred to us that someone with a disability would not just be listening, but speaking, or that someone in a wheelchair might be a leader. So I'm not going to lie, when I first bumped my wheels up to the edge of that altar platform with steps I couldn't climb for the first time, I just sobbed because it felt like the table was so far away. And I'd never seen someone in a wheelchair celebrate the Eucharist. And then I got mad. This is, several years into the pandemic. Many of my folks were on long-term quarantine lockdown in their assisted living facilities. And if I could share saltine crackers with Jane on either side of a plate glass window to share communion at her care facility before she died, then Jesus could show up at a table that I could roll up to. COVID had taken so much, and it was not taking this. So I'd say if I have learned one thing in this pandemic, is that Jesus shows up exactly where we are, and we all have a seat at the table.
Thank you so much, Kate, and thank you and please take the time that you need. And Sarah, we'd love to hear from you. Please introduce yourself, and could you share a story about your experience with chronic illness?
Thank you. For the visual description, I'm a light-skinned, dark-haired woman. I'm wearing a dark blue blouse, and I'm in bed, and there's a light pillow behind my head. One of my symptoms is cognitive something. I can't think of the word right now. And so I have written out my answers to read instead of speaking spontaneously. My name is Sarah Turner. I've been baptized for 50 years and sick with post-viral chronic illness for 16 years. Getting sick completely changed my experience of church. I used to be active in worship and Bible study and all kinds of events. But suddenly I couldn't even get to church on Sundays. When I did go, I often felt too tired to concentrate or even follow along. And then I started having near fainting episodes where I would get dizzy and almost pass out in the middle of the service. And you know how church is not really a place for lying down? Yeah, when someone lies down in church, it's very noticeable and very embarrassing. And it did not take many of those episodes for me to stop trying to go to worship at all for years. Every so often we moved and I'd try again at our new church. And every time I'd end up on the floor. And so I just quit. I just quit trying. Then one Sunday, my husband came home from another new church. He said, I think this could be a church for you. It's called St. Matthew's Episcopal, and they meet in a house, and there are couches. You could lie down at church. So I went, and it was just as he said. And not only that, but the priest there was Joseph Kovich, who uses a wheelchair. And there were other people with disabilities in the congregation, visible and invisible disabilities. But the thing I really want to make sure to tell about this church is about the crucifix. In the sanctuary is a crucifix, and on that cross, Jesus has only one arm. I was told that he used to have two arms, but the crucifix fell and one of them broke off, and they just decided, rather than fix it, to leave it that way. Because some people have one arm. And because Jesus welcomes people with one arm and with chronic illness and with every kind of disability. So that became my church.
Thank you all so much for sharing those personal experiences and experiences of faith and chronic illness. Our second question, I'll begin again with Dr. Meeks, is just a small one. What insights can you offer into who God is as a result of your experiences? Dr. Meeks.
You know, that's way above my pay grade, but let me try. So, but one thing I think God is, this whole experience has verified to me that God can be counted on, that God does know who I am, that things show up that I need, that sometimes that I couldn't anticipate myself, the surprises, the help that comes when you just completely at the end of your rope and just think, you know, if I have to, I don't know how I can do this for another day, and then something happens, there's some relief, the pain gets better, just some tiny thing that maybe doesn't even last, but the faithfulness, I guess, is what I want to, how I could summarize it. God's faithfulness has been verified over and over and over for me, which is why I said earlier, that piece is far more important to me than the building that I sit in, because ultimately it's how do I make it through the day? And I've had to work really hard, and sometimes I've been so exhausted because arthritis does indeed make you tired, as well as because it's the limitations, just, you know, you just work harder at everything. And I have just seen help come from unexpected places. And I count that to be God's, probably the angels. I don't know that God's running around doing everything. I think there's a big core of angels that are doing the work, but I've got my good share of them that have been dispatched to help me make it. So.
Thank you so much. Kate, same question question, are there insights that you would like to share about God, given your experience?
I will do my best. I just keep coming back to, I kept coming back to again and again, like the imagery of the Eucharist, and particularly the moment of the fraction. When you use those big priest toast and the crispy wafers, it makes this resounding, like visceral, I can feel in my bones crack. And just that body of Christ broken for you, that we are literally, physically, metaphorically, and spiritually fed by the broken body of Christ. And I think that means so much to me and my experience of long COVID and what it is to be disabled, and will always. So like for the past 200 years, lots of theologians like Origen of Alexandria, St. Augustine have asked, like, what will the resurrected body look like? Will we be sort of these like perfect spherical orbs, or will we be healed from everything, all the maladies that have plagued us throughout our lives? And for me, I don't think that's it, because Jesus was resurrected with his wounds. Even if medical science just advances by leaps and bounds, and I hope it will, and I am one day completely healed from the impact of long COVID, it will still be part of who I am. It will still be part of how I understand God. There is no resurrection for me without long COVID. And I want to be super clear that this is not something that I would wish on myself. Would not sign up for this. This is not something I would wish on anyone else. I don't think this is something that God chose for me for some sort of like greater reason or purpose. But we live in a world of free choice, and in that, terrible and beautiful things are possible. And as we've seen in this pandemic, our choices really impact each other. So I think despite our propensity, our human propensity, we're beautiful. We're also very human to make some selfish choices. We have a God who knows what it is to be broken, and that God can be with me in my brokenness, and a God who knows about the brokenness of our societal institutions and knows what it is to work for justice so that the world can be healed. A God who, even in his resurrected body, still had his wounds, and that we remember broken again and again and again, so that all are fed. And I think, like Jesus, we can choose to use our wounds, our brokenness, to connect with others in their own.
Thank you, Kate. Sarah, are there insights you would like to share about God as a result of your experiences?
Yes, thank you. One way to read the healing stories in the Gospels is that if you are sick and you meet Jesus, you will get well. The end. For people with chronic illness, this can be a confusing and discouraging message. Our story doesn't have that kind of ending. I once went to a healing service, and as people were going up for prayers, I felt like Dorothy in The Wizard of Oz, in that scene toward the end where they meet the wizard and he gives out gifts to all her friends. And then it's her turn and she says, "Oh, I don't think there's anything in that black bag for me." For me, since getting sick, there's always been a tension between trying to get well, and on the one hand, and on the other, accepting my illness and living the life that I have. It's hard to do both at once. But Paul is actually a helpful example for this. He says he has a thorn in his side, and he also says, give thanks in all circumstances. He doesn't say for all circumstances, but in all circumstances. And that feels more manageable, honestly. But gratitude has been a big part of my healing within my experience of illness. I think sometimes people experience God in a very personal way, like a close friend that you can talk to. And other times people experience God in a more abstract, transcendent way, like the radiant creative energy that suffuses the universe. My illness has pushed me toward the transcendent side, becoming aware of the frailties of the body. I don't even feel drawn to the incarnate God right now. I want to know a God who is beyond the weakness of the flesh and the limits of being a person, not a man, not even a person, not even really separate from us or me or any being, but more like a place where we're all united, and a place of unconditional love, where there's no separation from God and no separation from one another. And in that place, I am well.
Thank you, Sarah. And our final question is where our presentation kind of closed with all this advice that we had gathered from folks living with chronic illness and long COVID. So Dr. Meeks, we wondered if you had any advice for churches and clergy seeking to support folks living with chronic illness and or long COVID.
You know, I've had a lot of, and continue to experience this. People get uncomfortable when you can't do what they expect you to do. You know, to be able to allow people to be where you are, to be supportive rather than like you either not engaged enough or overly engaged. You know, I go to get up from a chair and somebody wants to help me up. I don't need them to do that. I need them because I need to do as many things for myself as I can do. But to learn how to be more balanced in paying attention to what somebody really needs. And I think that having a chronic illness makes you more conscious about that. I mean, I go into places and I realize, as Kate was saying about the altar being the way it is, so many places don't take into consideration the possibility of everybody not being homogeneous.
Mm-hmm.
Everybody should be able to do this. So just to be in environments where the church can become more sensitive, I think, to paying attention, to meeting people where they really are and being patient with that and supportive of that in a seamless way where you're not being reminded every minute of what you don't have. And we have, I think, some good work to do around that. I've had a lot of experience with people being pretty good at helping, but I've had a lot of experience with people getting on my nerves as well. So.
Well said. I'm also mindful that this is the last question in our panel. So I know folks who have been listening, they probably have a lot of questions yourself that are coming up. You can begin to drop those in our Q&A so that they'll be ready. Again, you can address questions to particular panelists for the panelists or questions about the research findings to me and to Emma. But before we wrap up, Kate, same question. Any advice that you would give to churches or clergy looking to support folks living with chronic illness and or long COVID?
So this sort of concept just keeps coming to me, which is the idea of the root word of religion, which is religio. And it's the same root word as like ligaments, you know, the things that attach bits of your body to other bits. It's the, you know, the way that we are connected. Religion is about reconnecting us who have been broken apart back together again. And like we have learned so much about reconnection, I think, during the pandemic, and we have so much left to learn, because there's so much I think we would rather forget, unfortunately. So for me, I am the same age as the World Wide Web. I'm in my 30s, and I grew up with celiac disease and a few other autoimmune disorders. So I was a sick kid, and I spent a ton of time online, and just finding community in like old AOL chat rooms and, Zango when that came out, and then Facebook Messenger groups, both groups that are specifically sort of gathered around particular experiences of chronic illness, but also groups that are gathered around particular fandoms. And just that sense of connection online when I wasn't able to connect in person was so, so important. And of course, that's something that we have dove into in the pandemic, when the church went online, as Erin and Emma, you said in your research findings, we were able to do this thing, this thing that we had hoped about for so many years. And apparently we could have done it the entire time. But the long COVID community online, I think, has so much to teach the church, because it really opened my eyes to what it is to sort of create these networks of connection, the religio. Because before doctors or clinics were treating long COVID sufferers were messaging back and forth online and connecting with each other and talking about symptoms and what was working for them, and advocated and set up research studies. And when the world had no interest in providing it, we made it for ourselves. But I think in the church, as people got more comfortable with the idea of COVID infection just being the norm, there is this sort of immediate pressure to go back into our buildings and restart everything the way that it was before. And so many churches stopped offering online worship or formation, or just like reduced its quality, so that basically like real church is in-person church, but you can watch us worship online if you would like to. And what drives me, what makes me so frustrated is, so for the 6 months that I was out on disability, I attended church, my 2 churches, every Sunday online. And what we count in the church tells us what matters to us oftentimes. And my online attendance didn't count towards the average Sunday attendance for my 2 churches, because online attendance wasn't real attendance. So now that we've oftentimes discontinued online gathering and in person we're unmasked, for those of us with long COVID, there's really no space for us. And we have to choose between our safety and our health and being part of the church, because sometimes it seems like the church is just more interested in the comfort of the many rather than the inclusion of everyone. So I guess for me, that sense of religio, that sense of reconnection, and that reconnection as the church, we can learn so much from online spaces, and we abandon them to our detriment because there's just so much good news to be found there.
Thanks so much, Kate. And last but not least, Sarah, what advice would you have for churches and clergy looking to support folks with chronic illness and or long COVID?
Well, some of my advice has already been given, because I think some of us have the same ideas. But I do want to talk about letting people with chronic illness know that our experiences are important, and asking people about their experiences of chronic illness in the church. In 2020, St. Matthew's did a Stations of the Cross called Another Ability, and invited people with disabilities in the congregation to write reflections on each of the stations. So I picked one of the times that Jesus fell down. And of course, I wrote about being on the ground, on the floor in public. And everybody did something different. But this project was deeply meaningful because it was the first time that some of us had been asked to share our stories in the context of our faith and in the story of Jesus. Also about making support visible. I agree with that. And it could be a Jesus with one arm, or it could be a picture of someone in a wheelchair. There are many ways to do that, but I think it's more important than most people realize. Even myself, I didn't know how much I wanted that until I experienced it. And the third part is I do agree with the idea of being humble. It's important that you try things and acknowledge that sometimes the things you try don't work out. I've had 3 churches provide a special chair for me so that I could come to worship and lie down. And one of them even gave me a full-size power recliner, my own lazy boy in church. And it was always wonderful to be so included, to have that accommodation, but it didn't solve everything. There are sometimes other factors that make it hard to come to church in the first place. So I just want to say to any churches making these efforts, try things, but don't give up if they don't work right away. And the second part of being humble is to be okay with people finding spiritual community in different places. As Kate said, there are many ways to connect with people online, and that doesn't have to be a threat to the local church. Maybe churches can ask their members, honestly, where are you living your spiritual life? And what's missing? And what part of that can we do together? Just questions like that, which brings us back to the honest conversation.
I would like to thank all the panelists for this honest, moving conversation, and we will continue the conversation with some questions from folks who are attending this webinar, and I'm going to read through a couple of those that are in the chat, and some of them seem to have, they've been addressed to specific people, but I want to make clear to the panelists that you should feel free to kind of weigh in as well if you have something to add. So I'm going to direct this first one to Kate, and then Emma and I can weigh in a little bit about what the research shows as well. But this question from Reverend Anderson says, how have clergy negotiated their work/wellness balance with their wardens/elders? I have very supportive wardens now, but in my previous parish, there was no understanding of my CFS and long COVID exhaustion, feeling ghastly, and the terrible brain fog, which caused serious stress and increased illness. How can we advocate for understanding and accommodation for invisible disability? So, Kate, would you be willing to address that question?
Sure. Hi, Ingrid. So for me, this one has been a real delicate balance. And I would say first is find your allies, because this negotiation of getting the support that you need to do the work you feel called to do is not something, at least in my experience, that I can do alone, because it takes so many spoons to do the work that to then have to negotiate back and forth with people who maybe don't understand. Ain't nobody got spoons for that. For me, circling in my bishop, my canons of the ordinary, We in my diocese have a clergy canon for support who has also been incredibly helpful. Circling in when I was on disability in the Episcopal Church, it's the church pension group. They have a medical advocate program who can do some of that advocacy work for you as well. And relying on all of those people so that I wasn't having to go into a conversation with a group who is tasked with caring for the church, which includes the clergy person, but having some people who are particularly at the table to care for you and your spiritual, emotional, and physical health. I did not know how much I needed it until my bishop showed up to my first Sunday that I was in the wheelchair and said, I'm happy to preach, I'm happy to preside, I'm happy to have a conversation with your vestry, whatever would be most helpful to you. So I pray that everyone has at least one person in their corner with them in those conversations. And also just to name that the church is so tricky because in no other field is it acceptable to ask such personal questions about health and disability. But in the church, there is a culture of this is the norm. So both knowing that you are not obligated to disclose any of your personal health information. But for me, I have found, in the privacy to oversharing spectrum of public clergy life, I am definitely on the oversharing end of the spectrum. Because I find that the more information, at least for my people, the more information they have, the less anxious they are. The classic is like, nobody likes when you change the liturgy because it feels very unsettling, which makes sense. These rituals are deeply grounding and ingrained and people are used to them the way that they're used to them. But by saying in the newsletter, we're going to be using a short form of the Eucharistic prayer because I don't have enough air to get through the long version. And it will sound a little bit different, but all of those familiar elements will still be there. And I hope you'll join me in praying in this slightly different way. So inviting people in if that feels safe to do.
That's so well said, Kate. I think that was basically what I was going to add from the research side is we had several clergy that participated in the study, and that aspect of allyship and amplification and support, I think, within the denomination is something that they named as helpful, and also helpful, as Kate, you just pointed out, in navigating what to share and what not to share, because you're absolutely right that sometimes sharing more information makes it better, but that is something that is also difficult when you feel obligated and uncomfortable doing that. So this becomes really challenging. I think one thing I'd just like to say is I think when folks are listening and they're on the other side, right, of like receiving the request for accommodations, I would like to live in a world that believes people. And I think in the church, we have an opportunity to do things differently than in other institutions. So I'm just going to say, what would it look like if we just believed people when they told us their access needs and we did our best to meet them? I would submit to you that that would help us all gain more than it might cost. So I'm just going to put the burden back on to the folks receiving the accommodation requests. Does anyone else have anything to add to that question? I don't want to miss anything. So the next question I see in the chat was, or the Q&A was addressed to Emma, and Kelly says, first, I would like to say how generous everyone has been for sharing their personal stories, struggles, and how they have overcome. Emma, what were you most excited to share today from all the research?
Hi, Kelly. She's my cousin. What am I most excited for? I think mainly what I was excited for this webinar was to share what people have said specifically. I mean, particularly Dr. Meeks, Enki, and Sarah, the wisdom that is just, there's so much unlocked wisdom because people aren't listening to those who are invisibly sick. There's so much that we can get to know about who God is. And so I was just most excited during this for these voices to be amplified and to create a space, a sacred space, and a safe space where we could just learn more about who God is based on what people who are chronically ill are saying. And just this idea of we're all given the gift of Imago Dei, we're all made in the image of God. And so being able to see different ways of what the divine looks like.
I do think that question is fair game for anyone else. If there's any excitement around the research, anything that you heard from the panelists, or just anything you heard from each other that you'd like to respond to, you'd be welcome to as well.
I'll just say one more thing. For one thing, I'm really excited that you're doing this kind of work, that this conversation is being brought to this level in institutions of higher education, where we're actually acknowledging that this is a good and worthy conversation, because in many ways, everybody has got some kind of limitation of some sort. And to have this sense of, I'm so able to do everything is to live in an illusion anyway. I mean, we've got shortcomings and limitations. And so I just think that the conversation can help us be more sensitive and caring and conscious and also gracious. And it really teaches us a lot about gratitude.
Thank you, Dr. Meeks. Anybody else have anything to add before we move on? So a question that I see here is, thank you everyone for sharing, from an anonymous attendee, sharing and research. I'm curious, what is the next step? I am interested in further advocacy training or guidance in how to have conversations with clergy/lay folks at church about chronic illness. I am still trying to understand my own illness, and I'm looking forward to learning how to have these conversations with more self-awareness. So I can certainly speak to the research side of that, but I feel like this is a question that also would be, I think, well answered by our panelists. So I'll give you guys a moment to think about how you would advise someone who is trying to understand their own illness, looking forward to having conversations with more self-awareness, and thinking about how to have conversations with clergy and lay folks at church about chronic illness. And thank you, Dr. Meeks, for that comment, because I think this is hopefully a step toward that. And we, hope to make this webinar available after the fact, so people can view it and can discuss it, hopefully in, church groups with leaders and lay people and how they want to respond. When we talk about the need for long-term sustainable care, I think that's a piece that, the church, we're going to have to get creative, because as we said, we're good at short-term care. We're good at baby registries and celebrations and meals when people have surgery. But what about folks who, are chronically ill? So how do we accompany them on the steps of this journey? I think those pieces of advice that Emma presented, those came across really strongly across this really diverse group of folks in terms of what can be done. And then, this is a preliminary presentation. So we said we're really interested in feedback, because there's so many, as Emma said, so many amazing testimonies and insights from the folks we interviewed. And so we're still kind of combing through the data and trying to fully analyze it. So one of our goals is to offer a little bit more of a popular resource for folks. We're obviously going to write an academic article. We always do that. But those things aren't widely read or shared. And so we'll hope to come up with a format in which we can kind of deliver this, not in a presentation format, but, you know, whether it's a pamphlet or a link, right, to, you know, a PDF on a website. So folks can view that in their congregations and really take it in kind of in a bite-sized format. And then this, you know, as I mentioned, this study was funded by the Calvin Institute for Christian Worship and housed at the Center of Theological Inquiry. And it was a very small grant, and we were only able to interview 18 people. So we would have to get a little bit more funding if we were going to kind of continue on with it. But I wouldn't be surprised if it's not just one article or one pamphlet, but a series of hopefully conversations and ministry and connections that come out of the project. Dr. Meeks, Sarah, or Kate, would you like to respond to this person who's trying to get a little comfortable with self-awareness, sharing their own story, and talking to clergy and lay folks about supporting people with chronic illness?
Well, the most important thing that I think that I could say, first of all, is the person herself has to be patient. Because when I had to learn so many things about arthritis, my physicians weren't even able to help me. So while you're in the pain, you're trying to learn things, you're trying to adjust, and to be patient with yourself is the first and most important thing, I think. And then to let other people know that they have to be patient with you too. But you have to get that message across to yourself first, because that's the hardest student when it comes to patience. So I think patience is an important key. I always looked at this, or not always, but when I got deeper into it, as I talk about arthritis as a teacher, as a tutor, teaching me what I would not have learned had I not had it. You know, I've learned a lot about taking care of myself and ways of looking at the world, and to not have to be careful not to have any kind of why me attitude. It's easy to slip into that without realizing it. And to be gracious, because every time I wanted to have a little pity party, I always found somebody who was way worse off than me. And I had to stop and say, you're only being asked to do this. You're not being asked to go to have that much, to be challenged in those ways. So I think to be patient, to try to stay grateful, and to be careful to just take a day at a time and don't run too far ahead of yourself.
Others want to respond?
Sure, I would add to that. I so believe in the power of prayer and the power of ritual to hold things that are just otherwise too much for us to hold. So when I first got my motorized wheelchair, I asked a good friend of mine, the Reverend Laura Tink Eberly, who's in the Diocese of California in the Bay Area, who's a deacon in the Episcopal Church, who's dealt with chronic pain for most of her life. If she would be, she is a beautiful writer of prayers, and I didn't have the spoons to sort of to frame how I wanted to use my wheelchair as a tool for ministry and a tool for my own freedom. But I had that desire. So we had a wonderful conversation. And she created a liturgy of blessing for mobility aid. And I invited all of my friends who also are chronically ill, disabled, and we got together on Zoom and we blessed that wheelchair before my first Sunday back. And just the power of, you talked about sort of those baby showers and bridal showers and, the rites of passage, the rituals. And I think for us as people who are disabled, as people who are chronically ill, we get those rituals too. And if they don't exist, we make them for ourselves and we make them for each other because it is worth honoring and celebrating the places that God is moving in our lives for freedom and healing, whatever that looks like.
Amen. Thank you, Kate. Sarah, do you have anything to add?
I'm just really grateful for what Dr. Meeks and Kate have both said. I'll just support that.
Well, I would like to thank our sponsors, the Calvin Institute for Christian Worship and the Center of Theological Inquiry. I would like to thank all of our panelists, Dr. Meeks, Kate Siberine, and Sarah Turner. I would like to thank Camisha L. Jones for that lovely poetry that opened us in such a spirit of prayer. I would like to thank my research assistant, Emma Worrall, and last but not least, our interpreters for today, Kathy and Craig. And thank you to everyone who is attending. I hope you will go and share some of these nuggets of wisdom with those around you in your communities and your congregations, so that we, the church, can do better in listening to people with chronic illness and long COVID, in receiving their experiences and the wisdom and insight that they have to teach us, not just about how to be better ministers and better people, but how to know God better. That's certainly what Emma and I have experienced in doing the listening and the research for this project. And we thank you all for attending, and we wish you a blessed afternoon. Peace.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.
Bye.